The barrier swallowed him whole and spat him out into another world. Harry stood with his trolley on the other side, blinking against the hiss of white steam and the smell of coal and something sweeter underneath. Pastry, maybe, or the particular warmth of a crowd pressed close together. Platform 934 was enormous and loud in ways he hadn't expected. Not loud the way Privet Drive was loud, with its lawn mowers and its neighbours' carefully modulated laughter. This was the noise of families. Everywhere he looked, there were mothers, straightening robes, and fathers loading trunks, and brothers hexing brothers and sisters crying, and someone's owl making a sound like a rusty hinge. And through it all, the great Scarlet engine sat enormous and indifferent, breathing steam into the September morning, like a thing that had been waiting for him specifically, though of course it hadn't. Nothing had ever waited for Harry Potter. He'd left the Dursleys at the barrier. That was the word for it, he thought. Left. Not goodbye, exactly. Uncle Vernon had said, right then, and Aunt Petunia had looked past him at the brick wall, as though hoping she could see through it to somewhere cleaner, and Dudley had called him a freak, which at this point was just a form of punctuation. Harry had pushed his trolley through the wall, and they had ceased to exist. And that was that. He found an empty compartment near the back of the train, hoisted Hedwig's cage onto the rack with considerable effort, and sat down. The seat was soft. It faced forward. It was entirely, completely his. He was still thinking about it. The worn red velvet, the way the window caught the light from the platform, the strange, uncomplicated fact of a seat that belonged to no one else, when the compartment door slid open. A boy looked in, tall and gangly, red hair, freckles scattered across his nose in clusters, wearing robes that were clearly several inches too short and someone else's idea of adequate. "Anyone sitting here?" the boy said. "Everywhere else is full." "No," Harry said. "Go ahead." The boy dropped onto the seat across from him, with the boneless ease of someone who had been getting on and off trains his whole life. "I'm Ron. Ron Weasley." "Harry. Harry Potter." Ron's eyes went immediately to his forehead, which Harry had learned to expect. He didn't try to hide it anymore. There was no point. "So the scar," Ron started. "Yes," Harry said. "Right." Ron absorbed this with the particular pragmatism of someone who had 5 older brothers. Then, "Want something to eat?" "My mum packed loads." He produced a stack of sandwiches and a handful of slightly squashed pastries from a bag and held them out with the uncomplicated generosity of someone who had never had to think carefully about food. Harry accepted a sandwich before he'd fully decided to. He ate half of it in 4 bites, and then made himself slow down, made himself look out the window as though he weren't hungry, as though he hadn't just eaten the best thing he'd tasted in recent memory. He set the rest of the sandwich on the seat beside him, with elaborate casualness. Ron pretended not to notice. Harry liked him immediately for that. They were somewhere past London, the city giving way to open fields, when the compartment door slid open again. A girl stood in the doorway. Bushy brown hair, very bright eyes, rather large front teeth, robes that looked new and precisely pressed. "Has anyone seen a toad? A boy named Neville's lost one." "No toad," said Ron. The girl's gaze moved across the compartment and landed on Harry with a small, arrested quality, like a needle finding a groove. She looked at his forehead. Then she looked at her memory, or whatever internal reference she was consulting, and her expression rearranged itself into something pleased and certain. "You're Harry Potter," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Harry said. "I've read about you, in Modern Magical History, and The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, and Great Wizarding Events of the 20th Century." She said it with the confidence of someone reciting from an extremely well-organized internal catalogue, You received the highest number of attempted dark spells, successfully repelled by a minor. You were 15 months old." Harry looked at her. He was aware, as he always was in these moments, of the distance between who she was describing and who he actually was. A small boy in second-hand glasses who had spent the morning eating, standing up because Dudley had taken the chair. "I'm Hermione Granger," the girl continued. "Nobody in my family's magic at all. It was ever such a surprise when I got my letter. But I was ever so pleased. I've been practicing everything we'll need for first year. Have you two memorized all the course material yet?" "No," said Ron flatly. Hermione looked at him, the way one might regard a mildly disappointing exam result. She surveyed the compartment once more, confirmed there were no toads, and swept out. "She's a bit much," Ron said. Harry thought about her reciting his life from the spine of a book, his scar, his age, his singular category, and the fact that none of it had anything to do with him. "Yes," he agreed. They finished the food in comfortable silence, the countryside unrolling outside, the train rocking gently beneath them. The light was beginning to change, the afternoon pressing toward dusk, when Harry looked at the empty wrappers and the blurred passing fields and said, without quite meaning to, "It's strange. I've never actually had my own seat on anything before." Ron looked up from the last of his pastry. "What do you mean?" "I don't know." But he did know. He kept going because it seemed, oddly, like a thing that needed to be said out loud at least once. "I slept in a cupboard, under the stairs at my aunt and uncle's. It's fine," he added quickly, aware of how it sounded. "I just mean the seat's comfortable. That's all." Ron opened his mouth, closed it. He had 6 siblings and a mother who packed sandwiches, and a face that had clearly never had to calculate where it was going to sleep. He did not have words for what Harry had just said, and he seemed to know it, and he didn't offer any. The compartment door opened. Hermione had returned to change into robes, and was halfway through a brisk announcement about the station approaching, when she stopped. Harry saw it, a very small pause, a recalibration behind her eyes, the last sentence he'd said landing somewhere in her. Then she continued, efficiently, and looked away. She had heard him. She didn't say so. The sorting felt like standing at the edge of something enormous. One by one they were called up to the 3-legged stool, and one by one the hat opened its brim and declared its verdict to the hall. The candles floated. The ceiling moved like a second sky, thick with the kind of cloud that meant rain somewhere distant. Harry waited in a line of children who were all, he suspected, equally frightened, which was some comfort. When his name was called, the hall went quiet, and then very loud. He walked to the stool and sat down, and the hat dropped over his eyes. A small voice said, thoughtfully, "You could be great in Slytherin." Not that, Harry thought. "Please." A pause, an assessment, then, "Gryffindor." The hat was lifted. The Gryffindor table erupted. He walked toward the sound, dazed, blinking in the light of 100 floating candles, and sat down among strangers who were clapping for him and grinning at him, some of them standing. A red-haired girl shoved along the bench to make room. A broad-faced boy held out his hand. Percy Weasley, Ron's prefect brother, leaned over and said, "Well done," and the applause kept rolling. Harry sat with it for a moment. 11 strangers, clapping for him, or for the scar, or for whatever shape the story had made of him in the years before. He understood there was a story. It didn't matter yet. It was the loudest welcome he had ever received. It was, in fact, the first. The dormitory was quiet by 11:30. Lavender Brown's breathing had settled into its slow, unguarded rhythm, and Parvati Patil had stopped rustling her sheets 20 minutes ago. Hermione waited 10 minutes more. She had learned already that Parvati sometimes went still, and then rolled over and started whispering at the ceiling. And then she sat up, reached for her parchment, and lit the tip of her wand with the small, careful light she had been practicing since August. She had been composing the letter in her head since the first week of term. That was the reason for the delay, not procrastination, which she considered a moral failing, but precision. She wanted to get it right. Each night, while the others chattered and argued over which of their new subjects was most interesting, she had been turning the paragraphs over in her mind, arranging the details in the correct order, choosing sentences that would convey necessary information without editorializing. Her parents were professionals. They would read what she wrote, not what she implied. She had planned to write about the staircases first, the ones that shifted between Tuesday and Thursday, so that the route from Gryffindor Tower to the Great Hall required not a single memorized path, but a decision tree. And then about charms, which was harder than she'd expected, because the difficulty wasn't the theory, but the physical precision, the exact angle of wrist rotation that separated a levitating feather from a feather that simply twitched and fell. She wanted to write about Professor McGonagall's transfiguration lesson, how they had all filed in to find a silver tabby cat sitting absolutely still on the desk at the front of the room, watching them with spectacled markings that should have been a clue to anyone paying attention, how they'd stood there, uncertain whether to sit, and then the cat had stepped to the edge of the desk and become Professor McGonagall in one complete and unhurried motion, and how the room had gone quiet in the way rooms do when everyone in them has just understood something they cannot quite name. She had written 5 drafts in her head. All of them began with the staircases. None of them said anything about Harry Potter. She set the nib to the parchment and wrote the date. September 14th, 1991. She got as far as Dear Mum and Dad, and then she sat very still for a long moment. She had been on the Hogwarts Express 3 weeks ago, making her way through the compartments looking for Neville Longbottom's toad, a task she found simultaneously tedious and straightforwardly kind, when she had found 2 boys, one with red hair who had something on his nose, and one with dark, tangled hair and round glasses, and a forehead scar she had read enough about to recognize immediately. She had not meant to stay as long as she did. She had been explaining what she knew about each of them, which seemed relevant, and she had been nearly out the door when the red-haired boy, Weasley, Ronald Weasley, as she now knew, had stood up to try a spell, and then Harry had smiled and said something that lodged in her memory like a splinter she couldn't quite locate. He had said, "I've never actually had my own seat on anything before." She had assumed it was a joke, a figure of speech, an 11-year-old's casual exaggeration, and then he had explained about the cupboard under the stairs, and he had said it in the same easy voice someone might use to say second bedroom on the left, as though it were simply a location, as though no one had told him it wasn't. She had asked him again, 3 days into term, casually, as if the subject had simply come up. She asked what his room at home was like. Harry had said, without looking up from his charms textbook, "Oh, I don't have a room at home, exactly. It's a cupboard, under the stairs." And then he had turned a page. She had asked about his birthday in a separate conversation, some days later. July 31st, he had turned 11 at the end of July, just before term began. She was still 11 herself, wouldn't turn 12 until the 19th. What did he do to celebrate? Hagrid had brought him a birthday cake. He had said it in the tone people use when they have reached the end of the story without realizing they have told a sad one. Hermione looked at the careful letter she had begun. She turned it over and started again. She wrote the way she wrote the lab reports she had been allowed to help prepare for her father's colleague at the dental school. Without opinion, only observation. She wrote, Harry Potter spent approximately 11 years sleeping in a cupboard under the stairs of his relative's house. She wrote about the clothes, Dudley's hand-me-downs, too large, described as best she could from what Harry had mentioned in passing, the way the cuffs fell past his hands. She wrote about the birthday cake from Hagrid being the only birthday celebration Harry could name. She did not write the word neglect. She did not write the word wrong. Her parents were professionals with good judgment. They would read the observations and arrive at the right word themselves. She signed the letter. She folded it and addressed it. She put on her dressing gown and shoes and walked alone through the dark castle to the owlery. It was cold at the top of the tower. The owlery smelled of straw and warm feathers and something sharp and animal that was not unpleasant if you were prepared for it. She tied the letter to the leg of a school owl, a reliable-looking tawny she had used once before, and watched it launch itself into the dark. She stood in the window after it had gone. Harry had said it in the same voice you use for weather. Light rain, might want an umbrella, a cupboard under the stairs. That was exactly why she had to write it down. He hadn't asked her to do anything. He had simply been answering a question, had not known he was telling her anything except an unremarkable fact about his own geography. That was precisely the point. Someone had to notice. Someone had to set it down in sentences and send it to people who would know what to do next. She turned and walked back through the quiet castle. She was 11 years old. She had done something she could not undo. She told herself that was fine. She was fairly certain it was fine. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in a suburb of London where the milk bottles were still on the step and the kettle had just finished. Hermione's mother was standing at the kitchen table, sorting through the post, when she saw the handwriting on the envelope. She recognized it immediately. She set the other letters down. Her husband was buttering toast. He looked up. She read it first in silence, which took longer than the letter's length would suggest. Then she sat down and read it aloud a second time, slowly, leaving space between the sentences. When she finished, neither of them spoke for a moment. Outside, a wood pigeon moved through the hedge in its effortful, ungainly way. The toast was cooling. Her husband set down his knife. "Right," he said. "I'm ringing Michael in the morning." That was all. There was nothing more to say yet, because what there was to do was not a conversation. Her mother folded the letter carefully back along its creases and set it on the table between them, and they finished their breakfast. The 19th of September came in the way of a school day in the middle of the week, which is to say without ceremony. The sun was watery and non-committal. Hermione came down to the great hall, sat in her usual place, and served herself porridge. No card had arrived from home yet. The letter had gone 5 days ago, and response took time, especially with school owls going the wrong direction, and she was not concerned. She was absolutely not concerned. She had known there would be a delay. Nobody at the Gryffindor table knew it was her birthday. There was no reason they would. She had not said anything, because announcing your birthday before it had been acknowledged felt, to her, somewhat like declaring yourself the winner of a race before the tape was crossed. She was on her second reading of the Transfiguration chapter, the first pass for comprehension, the second for synthesis, when something slid along the bench and stopped against her elbow. A chocolate frog. She looked up. Ron Weasley was engaged in close study of the opposite wall. He had egg on his collar and a second chocolate frog in his other hand. "Had an extra," he said, without looking at her. She caught the box before the frog could leap the table. "Thank you," she said, which was the correct thing to say. He did not answer, apparently still very occupied with whatever was happening across the hall. Hermione opened the box. Ptolemy. She already had Ptolemy. She had pulled him from her third packet back in August and had been faintly disappointed at the time. She tucked the card into her bag, underneath her copy of Magical Theory, and returned to her chapter. She did not examine her reasons. She ate her porridge and went to class. She was 12 years old. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 3rd week of October, tucked between a potions textbook and a jar of dragonfly wings. Harry noticed only because he was watching for it, not the letter specifically, but her face when she read it. Something shifted there, a tightening around the eyes, and then she folded it twice and slid it into her robe pocket before he could make out a single word. He didn't ask. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself this through charms and transfiguration, and a particularly tedious history of magic lecture, in which Professor Binns failed to notice that half the class had fallen asleep. By October, he and Ron had found their way into a kind of routine. They ate together, suffered through potions together, and spent one entire Sunday afternoon trying to master the hover charm, Wingardium Leviosa, which Ron kept mispronouncing until the feather caught fire. Ron had got it right eventually, after Harry gave up and went to bed. He'd been quiet about it, almost modest, which Harry found more appealing than he expected. Hermione had got it right on the first try, demonstrated it neatly, and then pointed out that Ron was snapping his wrist too sharply, which was accurate, but delivered in a tone that made 3 people immediately stop listening. Draco Malfoy had a pale, pointed face and white blonde hair, and a way of looking at people that suggested they had failed some private standard he'd never bothered to specify. He called Hermione know-it-all in the corridors, and worse where teachers couldn't hear. She held her chin up and didn't cry, where anyone could see, and made enemies on principle and had no friends. Harry thought about doing something. He thought about it quite a lot. But thinking about something wasn't doing it. And he knew that, too. On Halloween morning, Ron said the wrong thing at breakfast. Harry hadn't been listening. He'd been eating toast and watching the enchanted ceiling, and by the time he registered what had happened, Hermione was already gone, the bench scraping sharply behind her. Lavender Brown had her hand over her mouth. Ron stared at his porridge. Harry thought, "That's the worst one yet." He did not say this. The feast that evening was extraordinary. Hundreds of jack-o'-lanterns floating near the ceiling, candles burning amber and sickly green, tables piled with food that smelled like autumn, and something just slightly off. Harry had eaten 3 helpings and was considering a 4th when Professor Quirrell came staggering through the doors. His purple turban was askew, his face the colour of old plaster, and he grabbed at the doorframe as he lurched forward. "Troll," he managed. "Troll in the dungeon. Thought you ought to know." He then fainted onto the stone floor. Dumbledore's voice cut through the erupting noise. Prefects marshalled students toward dormitories. Harry let himself be moved 2 steps into the tide before stopping. Ron was beside him. "She doesn't know," Ron said. "She's been in the bathroom since breakfast," Harry said. They went against the current, pressing into a corridor that had gone very quiet and very dark. Harry had his wand out before he realized he'd drawn it. The second-floor girls' bathroom smelled of mildew and something raw beneath it. Before they reached the door, they heard it. Low, rhythmic crashing, methodical, like something very large that had never been taught to be careful. The troll was larger than anything that had any right to be indoors, grey-green and immense, dragging a wooden club along the floor. Hermione was backed against the far wall between a row of sinks, her face completely white. Harry shouted. The troll turned. Ron threw his wand up. "Wingardium Leviosa!" voice cracking on the second syllable, and the club tore free from the troll's grip and rose. It came straight down onto the troll's head, with a sound like a door being struck by another door, and the troll sat heavily and then toppled onto its side, breathing. Harry looked at his hands. Steady. He didn't understand why that was remarkable until he noticed what his heart was doing. McGonagall arrived with Snape behind her. Greasy black hair, sallow skin, black robes, an expression that told Harry precisely nothing. And Quirrell behind him, wide eyes fixed on the troll. McGonagall's square spectacles reflected the candlelight. "Explain yourselves," she said, and her voice was controlled and extremely dangerous. Hermione stepped forward. Harry watched something change in her face, a decision, rapid and irreversible, and she said, "I went looking for the troll. I'd read about them. They told me to go back, but I thought I could manage it." Her voice was perfectly steady. It was the best lie Harry had ever heard from someone he would have assumed was constitutionally incapable of telling one. McGonagall awarded Harry and Ron 5 points each. She gave Hermione a detention and told her it was extremely foolish behavior. She swept out with Quirrell at her heel, and as she went, her expression was not entirely disapproving, which from Professor McGonagall was something approaching warmth. Snape lingered a moment. His dark eyes moved across Harry's face, as if searching for something, found it or didn't, and followed the others without speaking. They sat on the corridor floor afterward, the 3 of them. Ron said something about the troll's smell, and Harry laughed, genuinely, and it felt like releasing something he'd been holding since September. They went back to the feast and ate trifle, and talked about nothing. Charms, Quidditch, whether Filch's cat could actually smell magic or was simply unpleasant on principle. Somewhere between the bathroom and the main staircase, they became something. Not loudly, not on purpose. It simply was. Harry was partway up the stairs when Hermione said his name from a side corridor. He told Ron to go ahead. She was standing with her arms crossed, not the way she usually stood, waiting to be right about something, but in the way that meant she was trying to hold something in. She looked at him. Actually looked at him, the way she sometimes did in class, right before she found a mistake, and he felt her register something in his face. He thought, without understanding why. She already knows I'm going to be angry. "I wrote to my parents," she said, "in September. About the cupboard. The hand-me-downs. What you told me." A pause. "They've started making inquiries through a solicitor. I wanted you to know before you heard it from someone else." Harry said nothing for a moment. Then, "You had no right." He heard it come out colder than intended, which was to say he'd intended it fairly cold. Hermione didn't argue. She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I did it anyway." Ron appeared at the top of the stairs and looked between them with the expression of someone who has walked into a room and correctly assessed the situation without additional information. "I think she's mental," he said, to neither of them in particular. "But I think she meant well." Then he turned and went back up. Harry went after him without speaking. The dormitory was dark and warm. He could hear Ron's even breathing from across the room, the comfortable sound of someone who had decided the day was over and meant it. Harry lay in his bunk and looked at the ceiling. He was angry. He tried to locate the anger precisely and found it was directed mostly at himself, which was inconvenient. He'd told her about the cupboard in September, when she'd asked something too direct, and he'd had his guard down. And then she'd asked again, gently, and he'd told her again in the voice he used when he wanted to make something sound smaller than it was. And she had listened. No one had listened to that before. Not and done something about it. Someone had heard what he said, and taken it seriously, and written a letter and talked to a solicitor. And somewhere in England, right now, there were adults who knew his name and thought it meant something was wrong and were trying to fix it. The feeling was indistinguishable from being in danger. He didn't know yet what to do with that. He didn't know yet that the feeling had a different name. He lay in the dark, and the castle settled around him, and the night was long and quiet and full of a strange, unnameable possibility that he didn't trust and couldn't let go of, and he did not sleep. The letter arrived on a Thursday, forwarded from the Muggle-worthy excuse committee in an unmarked ministry envelope, the kind that smelled faintly of their obliviator's preferred tobacco, and arrived with a brief attached note, flagged per protocol 14B, possible connection to registered address, presumed routine. It was not routine. Dumbledore read it twice at his desk, which was unusual. He was not a man who needed to read things twice. The letter was brief. A Muggle social worker, acting on a welfare inquiry received by the Surrey Child Welfare Authority, had been assigned to visit number 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, to assess the welfare of one Harry James Potter, minor. The visit had been scheduled for early December. The social worker's name appeared in the header, a woman with a composed, double-barreled surname that Dumbledore read carefully and committed to memory, although he would not be able to use it for anything. He set the letter down. He looked at Fawkes, who was sitting very still on his perch in the manner of a fire that has decided not to express an opinion. He thought, a Muggle social worker. He thought, welfare inquiry. He thought, Surrey. Only one person at Hogwarts could have provided information specific enough to trigger a welfare inquiry regarding Harry Potter's living conditions at a residential address. Only one person in Harry's year would have known those conditions at all, would have asked the right questions, filed the answers carefully away, and understood what ought to be done with the information. He had reviewed the first-year rolls in September. The child from the family of dentists, precise, academic, with the careful hand on her assignment submissions that suggested she wrote everything twice before committing to the final version, who had asked 4 members of staff in her first week questions that went considerably beyond the Year 1 curriculum. He had noted her as the sort of student who would become either very useful or very difficult. Both, it appeared, simultaneously. He sat for some time. The portraits on the walls were all asleep, which felt, today, distinctly unhelpful. Fawkes turned his head once and turned it back. The study was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when everyone present has been performing not thinking for a long time and not entirely succeeding. Dumbledore read the letter a 3rd time, which was unprecedented, and placed it precisely on the left corner of his desk. He summoned Professor McGonagall. She arrived in 4 minutes, which told him she had not been asleep. She was in full teaching robes. It was term time. She was always in teaching robes, with her hair in its severe grey-streaked knot and her square spectacles catching the candlelight. She looked at him, the way she had been looking at him for 30 years, with the level and undeclared assessment of someone who has learned to read him from the outside in and has largely stopped pretending otherwise. He passed her the letter without preamble. She read it once. She set it on the desk between them, and was quiet for a moment that was not quite long enough to call a long moment. "I told you in 1981, she said. "I told you those people were wrong for him." He had expected this. He had been expecting it in one form or another for 10 years, and now that it had arrived, he found it was exactly as difficult as anticipated. "Minerva, I spent the whole of the 1st of November watching that family," she said. Her voice was controlled and flat, the voice she used when she was feeling more than she intended to say. "The father came home at 4:30, and closed every curtain facing the street before he sat down. The mother spent 40 minutes trimming a hedge she had already trimmed the day before. The boy had a tantrum over a toy he had already broken. 9 hours I sat on that wall, and I told you exactly what I thought. I know what you told me. And you said the bond required it. The bond did require it, Dumbledore said. That has not changed. I know what the bond required. I have known for 10 years. She said it without inflection, meeting his eyes. I am asking you something different. I am asking whether you thought I was wrong in 1981, or whether you simply chose to proceed as though I was. The fire crackled. Fawkes stirred once on his perch and subsided. Both things, Dumbledore said carefully, can be true simultaneously. The second does not require the first. The look McGonagall gave him in response said clearly that this argument was not going to work on her this morning. He explained the bond again, not because she didn't know it, but because he needed the map of it spread formally between them. The charm had been sealed by Petunia Dursley's act of taking Harry in, Lily's blood in her sister's veins, that specific, non-transferable tie. It required a house that Harry called home. If any element failed, if Harry's legal home became somewhere else, if a Muggle court found in the Grangers' favour and Harry ceased to call Privet Drive home, the charm broke at once. Not gradually, not on appeal, not with negotiation. At once. She listened without interrupting. So, she said, when he had finished, the Grangers file their adoption application. The court processes it. Harry is made their son in the eyes of Muggle law. Privet Drive ceases to be his home. And then the bond of blood expires. Yes. And you have no mechanism by which to stop the adoption. Not through any channel available to me, he said, and was precise about the phrasing because she would hear the precision. Not without appearing in Muggle family court, which I cannot do. Not without using magic to interfere with a Muggle legal proceeding, which violates the statute. Not without... He paused. Not without doing something I could not justify to myself afterward. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then, when the social worker visits that house, what will they find? He did not answer. I think, she said, and her voice was measured and deliberate now, they will find a bedroom that was recently furnished. The Dursleys will have moved Harry out of the cupboard when the Hogwarts letters began arriving. They would have thought that far ahead. New paint on the walls, possibly. A mattress with the tags still on it. A pause. And I think they will find records. Reports from Harry's primary school. Teachers who noticed that he came in tired, that he had no birthday parties that any classmate could remember, that his clothes were always several sizes too large. They will speak to neighbours who will say the family kept very much to themselves. She folded her hands on the desk. I think the social worker will be good at her job, Albus, and I think the court will read her report and find what is right there to be found. He was still. The bond requires what it requires, she said, standing. I understood that in 1981, and I understand it now. What I am saying to you is this. A child who slept for 10 years in a cupboard under the stairs may look at a pair of caring Muggle dentists and decide he would rather be unprotected than go back there. And if he makes that decision, she paused. I am not sure he will be wrong. She left. Her footsteps were entirely steady on the spiral stairs. Dumbledore sat alone. The portrait nearest the window, a sharp-featured former headmaster who had been performing sleep with insufficient conviction, opened one eye and then, correctly reading the room, closed it again. The others maintained their unconsciousness with rather more dedication than usual. He looked at the letter. He thought, A 12-year-old girl and a pair of dentists. He thought, I have managed the ministry and the Wizengamot for the better part of a century. I have faced Grindelwald. I have outmaneuvered Dark Lords and midnight coups and 3 successive iterations of the Wizengamot's Rules Committee. I have made decisions that changed the course of this war 3 times over, and I have been right more often than I have been wrong, and I have always found a way. And Hermione Granger wrote 1 letter home. He thought, and I have nothing. The sherbet lemon tin sat on the corner of his desk. He did not reach for it. Fawkes sang a single clear note, not a full song, just the one note like a struck tuning fork held up to the dark, and fell silent again. Dumbledore thought about Harry Potter asleep 7 floors above him, unknowing. He thought about the summer of 1981 and the letter he had written in the dark, the precise and insufficient words. Petunia Dursley's face in the doorway. He thought about the small, hard certainty he had carried since that night, that he was asking something terrible of a child in the service of something necessary, and that necessity had always, in the end, been sufficient justification. He was no longer certain it had ever been sufficient for Harry. He thought about a 12-year-old girl who had looked at what Harry described as ordinary, and had known, with the confident machinery of a child who has never had a reason to believe the world cannot be corrected, that something needed to be done. He had spent 60 years being the person who decided what needed to be done. He was sitting in his study being outmaneuvered by someone who had been at Hogwarts for 9 weeks. He remained at his desk for a long time after the fire had burned low. He did not eat the sherbet lemon. He said nothing to the portraits. He waited for the night to run out. The gargoyle stepped aside without Hermione having to say the password. She had been sent with a note from Professor Flitwick, which apparently counted, and the spiral staircase carried her upward on its own, which she recognized as efficient and also slightly unnerving. She used the ride to study the architecture. The stone was very old. There were scorch marks near the top that seemed considerably older than the current headmaster's tenure. She knocked. She was told to enter. The office was nothing like she had imagined, and she had imagined it quite specifically. There were more instruments than she had pictured. Silver, spinning, making small sounds she couldn't identify, some pulsing with faint light that had no obvious source. The portraits on the walls were mostly asleep. The shelves along the far wall held books she had never seen in the Hogwarts library, and several objects she didn't recognize, and made a note to look up later. And on the perch beside the window, a phoenix. She knew it immediately. She had read Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them in July, twice. The scarlet and gold plumage, the long curved beak, the burning amber eyes. The bird looked at her without alarm. She looked back and felt, briefly, the specific satisfaction of recognizing something from a book in the actual world. Professor Dumbledore was standing at his desk. He was very old, considerably older than she had expected him to be in person, though she knew his age was considerable, with a long silver beard and half-moon spectacles, and he had the quality of people who have had their attention focused on one thing for a very long time and are now offering it, entirely, to someone else. It was a large kind of attention. Hermione found it more alarming than she had anticipated. "Miss Granger," he gestured toward the chair, "please sit down. Would you like a sherbet lemon?" She would not like a sherbet lemon. She also did not know how to decline when Albus Dumbledore was looking at her with that attentive silver gaze, and waiting. She took one. She held it in her hand through the wrapper and did not eat it. He sat down across from her and folded his hands on the desk. "I am aware," he said, "of the letter you sent home in September. The concern you expressed for Harry speaks well of you." A pause. I would also like you to know that I have been aware for some time of the conditions you described. They are not news to me." "Yes, sir," Hermione said. She was listening very carefully. She was hearing the things he was not yet saying. "There is a reason," Dumbledore continued, "that Harry was placed with his aunt's family specifically, not with any other family, and not with anyone in the wizarding world." His voice was careful and gentle, each word chosen with real attention. "There is an enchantment on that house. It was placed there 10 years ago, after Harry's parents were killed. It is tied to the blood of Harry's mother's sister, to Petunia Dursley, and to the house itself. As long as Harry can call that house his home, and as long as Petunia Dursley holds the connection that she does, the enchantment protects Harry from those who remain dangerous." He paused. "I cannot specify further without telling you things that are not mine to tell. But the placement was not arbitrary, and it was not made without knowledge of what those people are like." Hermione processed this. She believed him. That was the first thing she established in her mind. In the same careful way, she worked through the logic of a transfiguration problem. She had no particular reason to doubt that a real enchantment existed, that it was attached to that specific house, that real danger was involved. Everything she had learned about the wizarding world in 3 months confirmed that it was substantially more complicated than it appeared. She believed the enchantment was real. The second thing, she could not verify it. He had offered her no mechanism by which she could independently confirm the enchantment's existence, the nature of the danger, or the necessity of that particular house. He was the most powerful wizard alive and the headmaster of her school, and he was asking her to take his word for it. The third thing, if the enchantment was real, what it proved was that the danger was real. It did not prove the cost had been acceptable. A child had slept in a cupboard for 10 years. That was also real, and she had not needed to take anyone's word for it. Harry had told her in the voice of someone who does not know he is saying something terrible, which was precisely the problem. She held all 3 things in her mind at once, and sat with them. Professor Dumbledore was watching her with the patient attention of someone who is accustomed to watching people think and is not in any hurry. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, "I believe you that there's magic involved, and that it matters. But my parents haven't done anything illegal. They submitted a welfare inquiry because their daughter wrote home and described a child who had been sleeping in a storage cupboard for approximately 10 years. She kept her voice level. "The court will make its own decision. I don't think I have grounds to ask my parents to stop, and I'm not sure I should, even if I did." Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment. "You are 12 years old," he said finally. "Yes, sir," Hermione said. "Do you understand what you are asking Harry to be without? The enchantment is not abstract. The danger is not abstract. Without the protection that house provides, Harry will be unguarded every summer, every holiday, every hour he is away from these walls." "I understand that," Hermione said, "and I understand that you believe the protection is worth the cost. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying that I can verify the cost, and I cannot verify the protection. And I don't think that's a good basis for asking my parents to withdraw from a legal process." He was quiet again. "Will you think about it?" "Yes," she said. She had been thinking about it since he began speaking. She would not change her answer. "Hermione." He said her given name with a deliberateness that made her understand it was a different register than the rest of the conversation. "I have made decisions about Harry Potter's life that I am not proud of. I made them because I believed the mathematics of survival required them. I am asking you to understand that sometimes the best we can do is keep someone alive. Hermione thought about Harry saying the word cupboard in the voice of someone who didn't know it was a sad word. She said, "With respect, sir, alive isn't always the same as safe." She thought for a moment that this had landed somewhere it was going to stay for a long time. She placed the sherbet lemon on the edge of his desk and stood. "I'll think about it," she said again. "Thank you for explaining." She walked down the spiral stairs and through the corridor. She counted her steps, which was a thing she did when she needed to organize her thoughts into a manageable sequence. There were 93 steps to her next lesson, and she used all of them, and she didn't change her answer. Dumbledore sat alone with the sherbet lemon she had set back on his desk. He opened the drawer and looked at the one he had been keeping there since the morning he had read the ministry envelope. He did not eat it. He closed the drawer. He thought about Lily Potter. He thought about the specific green of her eyes, which he had seen only twice before her death, and had been seeing every time he looked at Harry since. He thought about the prophecy. Born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, and the familiar weight of it, the weight of something that could not be undone or altered or shared with anyone who would be affected by it. He had known the prophecy for 11 years. He had made every significant decision about Harry's life on the basis of it. He had told no one outside his innermost circle. He could not tell a 12-year-old. He could not tell Harry. He could not tell anyone who needed to know. He had, it occurred to him, spent 30 years making decisions that shaped other people's lives on the basis of information he would never be permitted to share with the people those decisions were about. He sat very still. He thought, she said alive isn't always the same as safe. He thought, she is 12 years old and she is right. He remained at his desk until the late afternoon light had shifted, and the instruments on their shelves had changed their quiet sounds, and he did not eat the sherbet lemon, and he did not find anything that felt like an answer. The social worker arrived at number 4, Privet Drive, on a Wednesday in early December, at 11 in the morning. The visit had been scheduled and rescheduled once. The second time, the family was at home, and the father answered the door. The report she filed, which Dumbledore would receive a summarized version of via ministry channels 3 weeks later, noted the following: a child, age 11, currently residing at a boarding school in Scotland. Contact address confirmed as the Privet Drive property during school holidays. No bedroom was visited, as the child was away at school. A box room on the first floor had been converted to a bedroom. The wallpaper was freshly applied, the furniture new, the mattress tags recently removed. The family referred to the child as the boy throughout the interview, and once, correcting herself, as the nephew. His name was not used. The father provided the school contact details with a readiness that suggested prior preparation. The mother remained standing at the kitchen door throughout. What the report could not note, because no report has a category for it, the particular quality of a family that has learned to keep its unkindness very quiet and has had many years to practice. The social worker did not know about the cupboard. She had not been told to look specifically for a door under the stairs, and the family had not mentioned one. But she had been doing this work for 11 years. She noted, in the language of her profession, family dynamic consistent with studied indifference. Follow-up review recommended. Evidence of recent preparation of the premises. She was good at her job. Harry didn't know any of this. He would not know it for months. Most of the school emptied out 3 days before Christmas. The dormitory went quiet in stages. Trunks dragged down the staircase, promises to write. The sound of Fred and George Weasley's extended theatrical farewell receding down the corridor until the silence settled into Gryffindor Tower, like something that had been waiting patiently for them all to leave. Ron pressed a package of chocolate frogs into Harry's hands at the bottom of the stairs. "Mum always packs extra," he said, with a careful absence of further explanation. He was the last one out. Harry put the chocolate frogs in his trunk and sat on the edge of his bed in the empty dormitory. He thought, "This is mine." The silence, the fire going low, the snow starting outside the window. All of it. He had nowhere to go, which had always been a fact about him, and tonight felt, almost, like a choice. He woke to snow still falling and a pile of presents at the foot of his bed. He stared at them for a long time before touching anything. There were more than he could immediately count. 5, maybe 6. And they were real, actually there. And he lay in his bunk, looking at them the way he had once watched other people's birthday cakes through a bakery window. Then he sat up. The Weasley jumper was first, forest green with a large gold H, from Ron's mother, who had apparently knitted one for him without anyone asking her to. Harry held it for longer than strictly necessary. There were chocolate frogs and something from Hagrid that was suspiciously tooth-cracking and definitely homemade, and a book from Hermione about the properties of certain Scottish gemstones that was actually interesting, which he suspected she had known when she chose it, and a brief note from Dumbledore that said only "Happy Christmas" in handwriting too ornate to be entirely casual. Then, wrapped in plain brown paper, no tag. Harry picked it up. It was lighter than he expected. He unwrapped it slowly, and the paper fell away, and the thing inside slipped across his lap like liquid. Silver, incredibly light, with the quality of something that had never worn out and was not going to start. The note that came with it, in an unfamiliar handwriting, said, "Your father left this in my possession before he died. It is time it was returned to you. Use it well." The note was unsigned. Harry read it twice. He sat with the cloak across his knees for a while and thought about his father, whom he had never met, and who had apparently left him something that made invisibility possible. He had been thinking about invisibility for the better part of 11 years, but not like this. He wrapped the cloak around himself and held out his hand. His hand had gone. He looked down, and his body had gone. There was a feeling to wearing it that had nothing to do with temperature. He stood in the middle of the dormitory, and the room was entirely visible around him, and he was entirely absent from it. He turned toward the mirror on the wall and saw the fire burning down, the snow at the windows, the empty room. No Harry Potter anywhere in it. He stood very still. He thought, "This is what I have been trying to do for 11 years, and now I have the actual version." He thought, Ron and Hermione are going to lose their minds completely. He tucked both thoughts away, walked out of the dormitory, and went into the night. He went to the restricted section first, because it seemed wasteful not to, and he spent half an hour reading things he was not supposed to read before he heard Filch's voice in the corridor and moved quickly into the nearest empty classroom to wait it out. The room was long and dim, lit only by moonlight through high, narrow windows. A few old desks pushed against one wall, and at the far end, propped against the stone, something tall in a gold frame that he had not been looking for. He stood in front of it for a while before he understood what he was seeing. The mirror showed him himself. Same messy black hair, same round glasses, same scar. But the version in the glass was smiling in a way he didn't recognize as his. Easy, unguarded, the smile of someone who does not have to calculate whether smiling is safe. Behind him, his parents. He knew them at once, which was strange because he had only ever seen them in photographs, and photographs are not the same as this. His mother had green eyes, his eyes exactly, and she was looking at him across the glass with an expression he had no name for because no one had ever looked at him that particular way before. His father had the same dark, untidy hair and a slight familiar tilt to his chin, and he was standing close, and both of them were there, and it was unbearable in a way that made him stand completely still rather than look away. He looked for a long time. Then he noticed what was behind them. Two adults, slightly smaller in the glass, set a little apart. A woman with something about her face he couldn't quite identify, and a man with a very straightforward expression, and next to Harry's own reflection, standing close enough to be touching, a girl with very bushy brown hair. He did not understand what he was seeing. He understood that the mirror was showing him something he wanted, and that he had apparently been wanting this, without knowing it, for longer than he could say. He stayed until the cold had settled deep into his feet, and his breath had been fogging and dissipating for what felt like an hour. Then he went back to Gryffindor Tower. Ron's curtains were still drawn when Harry climbed into his bunk. He lay in the dark and did not say anything about the mirror. He was not ready to say it. He was not sure what saying it would mean. He thought about his mother's green eyes. He thought about the two adults he had never seen before, and the bushy-haired girl, and the way the reflected version of himself had been standing as though he had somewhere to stand. He thought about what it meant that the mirror showed you what you wanted most, and what it meant that he had apparently wanted, without knowing, a specific shape of a life that included living people. He had never been someone who was getting what he wanted. He fell asleep with the mirror's image still in him, like something warm he hadn't earned yet, and the castle was quiet around him, and the night outside was deep and full of snow. The dungeons were cold in January, in a way they were not cold in October. October cold had the quality of a draft. January cold in the dungeons below Hogwarts had the quality of something that had decided to stay. Snape kept his office at a temperature that suited the preservation of ingredients rather than the comfort of people, which had never particularly bothered him, and sat at his desk in the first week of the new term reviewing third-year assignments with a competence that was also a kind of armor. Dumbledore arrived without knocking. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he sat down in the chair across from the desk, without being invited, without asking, and folded his hands on his knees with the particular settled quality of someone who has been rehearsing how to say something and has now decided to say it. Snape set down his quill. He looked at Dumbledore's face, and then looked at the wall behind him, which he found easier. "Tell me," he said. Dumbledore told him in the language of facts. A Muggle welfare inquiry, filed in October by a dentist and his wife in response to a letter from their daughter, a Hogwarts student, first year Gryffindor. The inquiry had escalated. The Grangers, it appeared, were not the sort of people who began a thing and left it unfinished. They had secured a solicitor, engaged with the relevant authorities, and filed an adoption application. A social worker had visited Privet Drive in December. Her report had been thorough. Dumbledore paused. "The cupboard," he said. Snape said nothing. He had known about the cupboard. He had not liked knowing about it, had not liked the particular sensation of knowing, which was a kind of dull pressure behind his sternum that he had identified, named, and filed away in the section of his mind he kept for things he was not permitted to feel. He had told himself it was necessary. He had told himself the blood protection was necessary. He had been right about both things, and neither had made the knowing comfortable. He had not thought about the cupboard since September, because thinking about it served no function. It had apparently occurred to a 12-year-old girl in Gryffindor that thinking about it was not the only option available. Snape thought, involuntarily, about Lily Evans. He did not intend to. He had spent 15 years calibrating the circumstances under which he permitted himself to think about her, a strict budget, carefully managed, and he did not like being surprised into it. But Dumbledore had said the word cupboard in that particular careful way, and the thought arrived before he could prevent it. She would have known what to do with that word. He thought about her laugh, not a general quality of laughter, but the specific sound of it, which he had not heard since he was 16, and which he had apparently retained in perfect fidelity for 15 years without wanting to. He thought about the letter he had drafted, and never sent after the incident in 5th year, after the word he had used, after the friendship had ended, and he had stood in the corridor alone and understood, with great clarity, what he had done, and why it could not be fixed. He had not sent the letter. He had stood in the corridor and understood and done nothing, and the pattern of that had apparently persisted. He had been protecting her son for a decade from a careful professional distance, maintaining cruelty as the camouflage his role required. It had worked, in all the technical senses of the word working. She had never known about it. She would never know. What she would have said about a dentist's daughter writing a letter home, whether she would have said, in that particular tone she had used when he was being willfully obtuse. Well, obviously, Sev, obviously that's what you do when someone tells you something like that. He could not know. She was dead. The list of things he could not ask her had been growing since 1978 and showed no sign of stopping. He said, without expression, "Can you stop it?" Dumbledore's answer was methodical. Not through legal channels. The statute prohibited appearance before any Muggle civil court. Not through ministry intervention. The ministry operated in secret from Muggle institutions and had no mechanism for engaging with Muggle law. Not through persuasion of the Grangers directly, also a statute violation, and in any case the Grangers were apparently not persuadable. He had attempted persuasion through their daughter. He had, he said, been very clear about the consequences. She said, Dumbledore told him, with something in his voice that was not quite admiration and not quite sorrow, and was possibly both, that alive isn't always the same as safe. Snape said, "Then it will happen. Unless Harry chooses to prevent it himself, I will speak with him in spring, when he has had more time to consider. I intend to explain the full situation." Snape considered this. He thought, Dumbledore is going to ask an 11-year-old boy to choose his own cage for the good of a war the boy does not know he is fighting. He thought, this is an accurate description of what Dumbledore has been doing since 1981, and he has been doing it because the alternative is a great deal worse. And being accurate about it does not make it untrue. He said nothing. Dumbledore left. Snape sat. He sat for a long time, which was not something he usually did. He did not, as a rule, sit and think. He graded papers, prepared ingredients, walked the corridors after curfew, with a purposefulness that looked like surveillance, but was also, if he was going to be accurate, movement for the sake of movement. He did not sit and think in the way available to people who had made a kind of peace with the contents of their own minds. He thought, Lily died so her son would live. He thought, she did not die, so her son would sleep in a cupboard under the stairs. Both of these things were true. He had known them both for 10 years, and had managed them by keeping them in different sections of his mind and never placing them directly beside each other. They were beside each other now, and they did not resolve. He could not apply any logic to them that would produce a clean result. The blood protection was real and necessary. The cupboard was real and wrong. Both remained true, regardless of what was done, and the only people apparently doing anything were a couple of dentists who had read a letter from their 12-year-old daughter and said, "Write." He did not go to Dumbledore. He did not write to the Grangers. He did not speak to anyone. He did nothing. This was the hardest thing he had ever done, because it was nothing. Meanwhile, in the corridor outside the Great Hall, Harry discovered by accident that Ron Weasley's birthday was on the 1st of March. Ron had said something offhand about the Quidditch season running through it and mentioned the date, and Harry had done a quick calculation and said, "That's your birthday." Ron said, "I suppose it is. Yeah." Harry had 8 chocolate frogs left from the box he'd been rationing since Christmas. He had been saving them because they were, simply, the best thing he'd eaten in years. He thought about this for the rest of the day. He had never given anyone a birthday present. He had never had enough of anything to give. On the 1st of March, he found Ron in the common room and put one of the chocolate frogs on the table in front of him. Ron looked up from his chess set. "Happy birthday," Harry said. Ron looked at the frog. He looked at Harry. He looked at the frog again, with the expression of someone who has been given something and is attempting to determine the correct response. "Cheers," he said. They were both quiet for a moment. It was a strange sensation. Harry recognized it, after a second, as the feeling of having done something right without quite knowing how. "Who did you get?" Harry asked. Ron opened the box. "Agrippa," he said, with considerable satisfaction, and held the card up for Harry to see. "Haven't got this one." Harry didn't have Agrippa either. He thought about mentioning this and decided against it. Some things were worth more than a fair exchange. February had a particular quality at Hogwarts that Harry was still getting used to. The cold was established and settled. The novelty of everything had worn down to something more every day, and the castle had the feeling of a place that had been lived in long enough to start having opinions. He had not heard anything official. He knew from Hermione, who had mentioned it once, in the precise and careful voice she used for information she was not sure how to deliver, that her parents had submitted paperwork. He had not asked her to say anything else about it. He had been deliberately not asking, which was a different thing from not wanting to know. He told himself, in the practiced way of someone who has had a great deal of experience telling himself things, that it would probably come to nothing. Adults started things and didn't finish them. He had learned this early and thoroughly. The world did not suddenly change for Harry Potter. The world had a particular consistency, and that consistency was the absence of change. He had survived 10 years on that understanding, and he saw no evidence it was wrong. He went to classes. He did well in charms and very well in transfiguration, which Professor McGonagall graded with the precise fairness of someone who was not going to allow personal feelings to interfere with academic standards, and was giving him full marks because they were earned. He ate dinner with Ron and Hermione. He did not ask. Then he received a note asking him to come to Professor McGonagall's office on a Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Her office was on the ground floor and smelled of parchment and something that might have been heather, and she had a fire going and a tin of ginger newts on the corner of her desk. She was sitting very upright in her chair behind it, which was always true, but today seemed to mean something additional. The way she looked at him when he knocked and came in, direct, measured, with the expression of someone who has been deciding how to say something for a long time and has now decided, made him understand before she spoke that this was not about an assignment. He sat in the chair she indicated. "Harry," she said. She had never called him by his first name in a formal context before. The shift registered. "I have been asked by Professor Dumbledore to speak with you about a matter that concerns you directly. I am going to do that. I am also going to tell you several things he did not specifically ask me to tell you, because I think you are entitled to have the full picture. Do you understand?" "Yes," Harry said, which was true enough. She told him plainly. Hermione Granger's parents, she said, had filed a formal adoption application with a Muggle court in October of last year. The application had been supported by a report filed by a social worker who had visited number 4, Privet Drive, in December. The court date was set for April. As matters stood, the application was proceeding well. She paused. "Professor Dumbledore has asked me to convey to you that you have a choice in this matter. If you wish to request that the court consider a different outcome, that is your right. He would like you to be aware of it." A pause. She looked at him steadily. "I want to make sure you understand that what Professor Dumbledore is asking you to consider is complicated, and I want you to have everything you need to think about it properly." She told him about the blood protection in the plainest terms she could manage. She did not use the name of the person who had killed his parents. This was not unusual in the wizarding world in 1992, and in any case, she was trying to give him information, not fear. She said, "There is an enchantment on your aunt's house. It was placed there after your parents died. It is attached to your mother's blood, specifically to your mother's sister, and to the blood connection between them. As long as that house is your home, the enchantment protects you from the person who killed your parents." She let that sit for a moment. "If you move to the Grangers," she said, "the enchantment breaks. Immediately, the protection ends." She looked at him across the desk. "You deserved to know that before anyone asked you to decide anything." Harry had not spoken since she began. He was looking at the tin of ginger newts as though it were the most interesting object in the room. It was clearly not the thing he was most interested in. He was silent for a long time after she stopped, long enough for her to refill her tea, quietly, and set it down, and wait. Then, "So the only reason I was ever at the Dursleys was because of the charm." "Yes, in large part. Not because they wanted me there." He said it flatly, without inflection, which was somehow worse than if he had said it with feeling. "Not because anyone thought they were, that they could manage it. Just because of the magic. The protective enchantment required a blood relative." "Yes." He absorbed this. The fire made a small sound, and Professor Dumbledore knew what it was like there. McGonagall said, "He had been informed, yes. And he left me there anyway." She had known since October that this question was coming in some form. She had thought about how to answer it through November and December and all of January. She had prepared several responses, all of which were accurate and none of which were adequate. She said, "Yes." The silence in the room was a particular kind, the kind that comes after something has been said that cannot be unsaid and does not need to be added to. Harry looked at the tin of ginger newts. His face was very still. McGonagall recognized it, after 30 years of teaching, as the face of a child who has decided that doing something particular with his expression is not currently available to him, and so is doing nothing instead. She thought, he is 11 years old. He has known for 10 of those years that the world does not care for him in any active way, and he is sitting in this chair listening to confirmation of that, and he is not breaking, and I have been quietly furious on his behalf for a decade, and it has not changed anything, and it is not going to change anything by my being furious now. She did not say any of this. After a while, Harry said, in a voice that was very careful and very even, "Are they, the Grangers, are they actually all right, as people?" She set down her cup, She had spoken with Hermione's parents twice, once in a flu call in November, once by letter, and she had formed a view. "I have been in contact with them twice," she said. "They have done everything correctly, and with considerable thoroughness, and without any performance of urgency. They are very practical." A pause. "They asked after you specifically, whether you were doing well in your studies, and whether you had made friends. They seemed genuinely interested in the answers, not in the quality of the questions." She looked at him. "They are, I think, a great deal too clever, which is evidently where Hermione gets it. They are also, I believe, very kind. They are exactly what Hermione would have for parents. I mean that as the recommendation, it sounds like." Harry made a sound. It was not quite a laugh. It was what a laugh becomes when it is surprised into existing by something you were not prepared to find funny. He said, "Right." He sat for a moment. He said, "Thank you. For the full picture." McGonagall said, "Yes." He stood and looked as though he was going to say something else, and then didn't. He found Ron and Hermione in the common room, which was where they were most evenings. Hermione was studying with proper thoroughness. Ron was performing the visible behaviors associated with studying. Hermione looked up when Harry came in, and then, reading something in his face, said nothing and went back to her book. Ron looked at Harry, looked at Hermione, looked at Harry again, and turned back to his parchment. Harry sat in the armchair nearest the fire. He did not say anything about the conversation. He just sat there, which was its own kind of saying something. Nobody asked. After a while, Ron put down his quill and reached into the side pocket of his bag, where he kept the chess pieces when he was carrying them apart from the board. He set the black rook on the arm of Harry's chair without comment. The black rook was Harry's best piece. Ron had known this since their second game. Harry picked it up and turned it over in his hand. "Do you want to play?" Ron asked. "Yeah," Harry said. They played for 2 hours, until the clock said 9, and the fire had burned to orange, and Hermione closed her book and said they should all go to bed. Neither of them argued. Harry won the first game. Ron won the second and third, because Ron always won eventually. It was, Harry thought, going up the stairs, one of the better evenings he'd had. He was not going to think about why yet. He was going to go to sleep and think about it later, in the ordinary morning, when it might feel less like something he couldn't afford. On the 1st of April, Fred and George Weasley turned 14 and celebrated with the specific creative thoroughness that had made them a legend in the upper years. By 11 in the morning, the corridors near Gryffindor Tower smelled powerfully of something between old socks and rotten eggs. The smell had the determined quality of something that had decided to stay. Harry found, moving through it on his way to breakfast, that he didn't entirely mind. It was the smell of people doing something cheerful on purpose, which was a category he was still getting used to. The summons arrived that afternoon, on cream-coloured parchment, in handwriting too ornate to be casual. Harry had been expecting it since February. He felt, reading it, the particular settling that comes when something you have been bracing for long enough finally arrives and becomes actual rather than anticipated. He went up the spiral staircase. The gargoyle stepped aside without requiring the password, which meant it had been given in advance, which meant Dumbledore had been ready for him. The staircase moved beneath him, and he rose with the sense of someone ascending toward a thing they had already decided about. Dumbledore was at the window when Harry entered. He turned, and there was the silver beard and the half-moon spectacles, and the long, crooked nose, and the quality he always had of regarding whoever was in front of him as though they were the only interesting thing in the room. "Harry, please sit." He moved to his desk. "Sherbet, lemon?" Harry took one. He held it in his palm, through the wrapper. It was what Hermione had done in November. He hadn't known that. He simply thought, I am not going to eat this. It is a prop. We both know it is a prop. And he sat with it in his hand. Dumbledore looked at the sherbet lemon in Harry's palm. He sat back slowly. Minerva's student, he said, very quietly, to no one in particular. He explained the blood protection more fully than Harry had heard it from anyone. Harry could tell. There was a quality to how Dumbledore was choosing his words, like someone unfolding a map that had been kept very carefully folded for a long time, and deciding to lay out the whole of it at last. Lily Potter had loved her son. This was not, Dumbledore said, a small thing. When a person of great love gives their life to protect someone, that love does not vanish. It transmutes. It becomes something that lives in the blood of the person protected, a quality that causes harm to those who would hurt them. Lily had given her life for Harry. That magic lived in Harry. It would always live in Harry. No adoption could remove it. No change of address could diminish it. And separately, differently, there was the charm Dumbledore had placed on the Dursley house. This charm was anchored in Lily's blood in Petunia, specifically. As long as Petunia's house was Harry's home, Voldemort could not reach Harry there. Harry registered the name. It landed differently than the person who killed your parents. It had weight. It was specific. It meant something. He had grown up hearing it avoided. Dumbledore said it the way he might say any other name. The charm is unique, Dumbledore continued. I cannot place it elsewhere or anchor it to a different address. It requires specifically Petunia, specifically her act of taking you in, specifically the house you have called home for 10 years. That is the nature of the magic. And if the adoption is finalized and Privet Drive ceases to be your legal home, the charm expires at once. Harry had been listening carefully. He had been listening in the way McGonagall had taught him to listen. Not a lesson she had given in Transfiguration, but the lesson she lived every time she was in a room. Hear the whole thing before you respond. He said, You're asking me to go back to the Dursleys. I am asking you to consider what it means to be safe. I was safe for 10 years. I was also in a cupboard. Are those the same thing? Dumbledore was quiet. Then he said, No, they are not the same thing. They were the compromise I was able to make. Harry looked at him. The morning sun was at a low angle. The instruments on the shelves were doing their small, quiet work, and Fawkes was sitting very still across the room. You made a compromise with my life, Harry said. Yes. Without asking me. You were 15 months old. I could not ask you. And later, Dumbledore paused. There was no obvious moment at which later became the right time. That is not a defense. It is what happened. Harry thought about the 10 years that had been a compromise. He thought about the version of himself who had slept in the cupboard and told himself this was ordinary, who had learned to be invisible because invisibility was useful, and how it had taken one train journey with a boy he didn't know to begin dismantling that particular thing. He thought about the mirror in the empty classroom, and the 2 adults he didn't recognize, and a girl with bushy hair standing close. I understand why you did it, he said. I think it worked, mostly, for what you were trying to do. I'm still not going back. Before I say it officially, Harry said, I want to know something. Does the blood charm work inside Hogwarts? Dumbledore regarded him with the careful attention of someone recalibrating. Hogwarts has its own protections, separate from the charm. While you are within these walls, other enchantments apply. The blood charm specifically protects you from Voldemort's reach outside Hogwarts, during the summers, during the periods between terms. Harry nodded. He had been thinking about this since February, in the methodical way Hermione had accidentally taught him by demonstrating it constantly. The charm mattered for the summers. It did not change what was happening inside Hogwarts right now, which was something he had been thinking about separately and was not going to raise with Dumbledore in this particular conversation. "So I have until the end of term before it becomes urgent," he said. "And I'll be here when anything that needs to happen this year happens." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment with an expression Harry could not entirely read, and Harry looked back steadily and did not add anything. "I'm not going to ask the court to change its decision," Harry said. "I'm not going back to the Dursleys for the summer." The room was quiet. Fawkes shifted once on his perch. "I believe," Dumbledore said, "that you are making a decision I would not make in your position. I also believe it is your decision to make, and I have already asked too many things of you for too little honest explanation." He folded his hands. "I will make other arrangements for your protection when you are outside these walls. I cannot promise they will be as strong as the blood charm. But they will exist, and I will not leave you unguarded." Harry looked at him. "Thank you for telling me the truth. You could have not said anything and let everyone think it was fine, or given me a version of it." Dumbledore said, "I thought about it." Harry absorbed this. The honesty of it was almost startling. This specific kind, which was the honesty of admitting you had nearly been dishonest. It sat between them like something neither of them needed to add to. He stood. He set the sherbet lemon on the desk. "Thank you," he said. He went down the stairs and out into the castle. The April light was coming through the end windows at an angle that made the corridor look like something from a different kind of story, and somewhere below him, Fred and George were still celebrating, and he stood still for one moment in the middle of it and thought, "All right then," and went to find his friends. 3 weeks later, Dumbledore received a brief note through his Muggle contact channel, the same route as December's summary, repurposed for the proceedings. The provisional adoption order had been granted. Home visit to the Grangers completed satisfactorily. Final hearing scheduled. Subject to standard compliance, the final order was expected by late June 1992. He read it once and set it down and sat. Fawkes sang, not the full song, not the enormous version that could lift the heart out of despair, just a small thread of music, the kind that meant, "I am here. I am attending. This matters." Dumbledore sat in his study and listened until the song was done. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in May, carried in by a school owl, and delivered directly to Hermione at breakfast. She opened it, read it, and sat very still for a moment. Then she slid it across the table to Harry. He read it twice. He put it back on the table. "All right," he said. Hermione looked at him in the way she had been learning to look at him since October, with specific attention to what certain words cost him to say, and what they meant when they came out smaller than the situation warranted. She knew that "all right" in Harry's vocabulary covered a range from fine to "this matters in a way I cannot currently discuss," and that the difference was invisible to most people. She took the letter back and folded it carefully into her bag. He finished his porridge. They went to Transfiguration. They had known since March that something was wrong in the third-floor corridor. It had been accumulating. Small observations, individually explicable, that had reached a critical mass somewhere in April and become a theory none of them particularly wanted to have. Hermione had tracked down Nicholas Flamel in a library book in February, and the theory had subsequently grown more specific and more alarming. The Philosopher's Stone, capable of producing the elixir of life, was hidden underneath the school, and someone was trying to reach it. The someone, they were reasonably certain, was Quirrell. They had been careful about this, careful about who they said it to, careful about how directly they said it out loud, careful about the fact that saying it made it more real, and more real was not always desirable. Quirrell was their defense against the dark arts professor. He had a stutter. He smelled of garlic. He had fainted at the Halloween feast. He was also, Harry was increasingly certain, something other than what those details suggested, and the gap between the surface and the something was what worried him. He had been watching Quirrell since April, with the particular careful attention of someone who has spent a long time watching people without appearing to watch them, and he had filed what he observed in the part of his mind that dealt with things that were true but not yet actionable. What had changed in May? What Harry had noticed and hadn't told anyone because he couldn't find the right words for it was the quality of how danger felt. Before April, danger had been abstract. He had survived it because there was nothing else to do. On a broom with a jinxed broomstick, he had held on because falling was not a better option. He had gone into the girls' bathroom on Halloween with Ron because she didn't know, and they couldn't leave her there. He had done these things and survived them, and not thought carefully about the alternative, because the alternative had always had a vague and weightless quality, the absence of something he hadn't quite convinced himself he possessed. But there was something on the other side of June 24th. He thought about this sometimes at night when the dormitory was quiet and Ron was breathing steadily 4 feet away. There was a hearing on June 24th, and after the hearing there was a summer, and the summer had a shape. He had never had a summer with a shape. They had always been things that happened to him, long stretches of endurance between terms, managed rather than lived. This one had a date, and after the date, an address he had never been to, and people he had never properly met, and a room that had been furnished for him without his asking for it. He did not want to die. He had probably never consciously wanted to die, which would be the ordinary view, but it had been a dull and abstract preference, rather than a relationship to the future. Now it was specific. He had a reason, and the reason had a date, and the month of May had a quality it had never had before, a forward pressure, a direction, the particular gravity of a person moving toward something, rather than simply surviving until the next thing. This was not courage. Courage was when you were frightened and did it anyway. This was something quieter and more decided than courage. He had a reason. They went through the trap door on a Thursday evening when the castle was quiet. Fluffy was asleep. A harp had been left playing, a thin looping melody across the silence, and the trapdoor beneath him led to Devil's Snare, which Hermione had navigated by staying absolutely still while Harry and Ron resisted every instinct they had. The flying keys were in a vaulted room above the next door, hundreds of them circling the ceiling in loose orbits, and Harry had caught the right one in under 3 minutes on a broomstick that still wanted to fly because that was its nature. The troll was already unconscious, which was someone else's prior encounter, done and cleared. The chess room was different. The board was full-sized, pieces as tall as Harry and Ron, the flagstone floor serving as the board, and the white side faced them across it with the settled confidence of a game already in progress. Ron looked at it for a long moment, head slightly tilted, in the way he looked at games rather than thinking about them. They played. Hermione took a bishop. Harry took a castle. Ron directed them with the quiet economy of someone who has never found chess complicated and simply understands what others call strategy the way other people understand walking. The White Queen was devastating in the way chess queens always are. She moved like something that had decided to be inevitable. Ron said, "I have to let her take me." Harry said, "What?" "It's the only line. She takes me and you've got the king." He said it the way you say something you've already decided about, without drama and without hesitation. You go ahead. Don't stop for me. Harry looked at him. The hand-me-down robes and the red hair and the expression of someone doing a perfectly obvious thing and not understanding why anyone would find it remarkable. He thought about the 1st of March and the chocolate frog on the common room table, and how Ron had never, in 8 months, made Harry feel that the friendship had a cost. Not because there wasn't one. There was always a cost. But because Ron had come from a family where love was given freely and had simply brought that with him when he packed his trunk. Go, Ron said. Harry went. Hermione stopped him at the potion puzzle. She had sorted the 6 bottles in under 2 minutes. Logic, not magic, she said, with the specific satisfaction she always had when the answer turned out to be logic. And she held out the correct bottle and looked at him. Come back, she said. Not good luck. Not be careful. Not I believe in you, which would have been true, but was not what either of them needed at that particular moment. Just come back, as though it were the simplest and most necessary instruction she had ever given. I will, Harry said. He meant it in a way he would not have meant anything in September. The purple flame closed behind him, and he was alone in the last room. It was quieter than he had expected, the stillness of a room that has been waiting for a specific person, long enough to have grown patient. And at the far end, in the dark, the thing he recognized, tall, gold-framed, the faint quality of its reflection catching light from no visible source. He had stood in front of this mirror in December and seen his parents, and seen, behind them, 2 people he didn't know then. He was not alone. Quirrell stood at the edge of the room. The stutter was gone. He was very still, and his eyes were dark and deliberate, and the turban cast a shadow across half his face. Harry had known, entering, that he would be here, had known it somewhere beneath his conscious thinking since April, and the knowing didn't make it simpler. You, Quirrell said. Not an accusation, a confirmation, like finding something where he had expected to find it. Harry did not answer. He walked to the mirror. In it, he saw himself. Not frightened, not taking up less space than he occupied. He was smiling. The easy, unguarded version he had seen in December and not quite understood. His parents were behind him, smaller now, slightly further back, and in front of them, closer. The 2 adults he had seen and not known, who he now understood without having been introduced to them. And next to him, standing close enough to be touching, Hermione. He felt it before he understood it. Something settled in the reflection, a quality of arrival, of something that had been moving for months finally coming to rest. And in the mirror, his hand went to his pocket, and he felt the weight of the stone drop into his actual pocket with a solidity that left no room for uncertainty. He closed his hand around it. He did not look away from the mirror. Behind him, in the room that was not the reflection, Quirrell began to walk toward him. Quirrell's hands closed around Harry's wrist. The burning was immediate. Not the burning of fire, not something from outside, but something that erupted from inside Harry's own body, as though his blood had decided to do something with significant consequences. He understood, distantly, that it hurt. But the hurt was secondary to the fact that it was working. Quirrell was recoiling, his hands blistering where they touched Harry's skin, his face twisting with something between pain and disbelief. Harry had not planned what came next. He pressed his palms against Quirrell's face, both hands holding on, and it was less a decision than an understanding that stopping would be the wrong thing to do. Quirrell screamed. His face was dissolving where Harry's palms touched it, not in the way things burned, but in the way things came unmade, and Harry held on because he had June 24th, and because his hands seemed to know something he hadn't taught them. Then something tore free. Not from the room, from Quirrell himself. A cold, dark presence passing through Harry on its way out. A sensation like a fist closed around his heart for the half-second it took to go. And then it was gone, and Quirrell was on the floor, and the room was very still. Harry looked at his hands. They were shaking. They were his. He did not entirely lose consciousness immediately. There was a period of being on the floor with his face against the stone and the cold coming up through it, thinking with the specific clarity that comes when the brain has nothing left to spare for anything but the essential thought. The thing that had burned Quirrell was not the blood charm. He understood this the way the body understands things before the mind has caught up. The blood charm lived in a house, in Petunia's act, Petunia's blood, a specific address. It was a thing he had to go somewhere to have. What had just burned Quirrell did not live anywhere external. He could feel it still, in his hands, in the place where the burning had come from. Something in him, not attached to him, that had been there since before he knew what it was. His mother had stood between him and something unsurvivable, and the love in that act had not vanished when she died. It had gone into him, into his actual blood, his actual hands, and it burned things that would hurt him, and it had nothing to do with where he slept. He had been in the cupboard for 10 years, not because of this protection, he thought, on the stone floor. This would have kept him safe anywhere. He had been in the cupboard for the other kind, the address-specific kind, and the other kind was gone now, as of whenever the adoption was finalized, and he was still lying here, burning with the kind that stayed. He thought, I was never carrying the sacrifice to a particular place. He thought, I was just carrying it. Then the dark completed what it had started. He woke to light, the specific quality of late afternoon sun through high windows, the kind that meant the calendar had moved without him. He was in the hospital wing on a proper bed, and Dumbledore was sitting in the chair beside him, in the manner of someone who had been there for some time and had adjusted to the quality of waiting. Harry looked at the ceiling. He turned his head. How long? He said. His voice came out rough. 3 days, Dumbledore said. It is Thursday afternoon. I have been reading. He gestured toward a book on the side table, which Harry noted was upside down. I am very glad you are awake. Harry lay there. He thought about what he needed to ask. He had been structuring it, distantly, even on the floor of the mirror room. The thing that burned Quirrell, he said. Was that the same as the blood charm, the Petunia thing? Dumbledore was very still. Then, no. They are different magics. What burned Quirrell is your mother's sacrifice. It lives in you. Not in a house. It will always be there. It does not require you to live anywhere in particular. Harry looked at the ceiling. So the cupboard. All of it. All 10 years. That was about the other kind of protection. Not the one that burned Quirrell. Yes. The sacrifice magic would have worked anywhere. Yes. You didn't tell me that, Harry said. When you explained the blood charm and why it required the house. You explained the charm. You didn't tell me this other thing existed separately. Dumbledore said, No. I told you the truth. I did not tell you all of it. A pause in which he seemed to be deciding something. I have a long habit of telling people the truth, while withholding the parts that might lead them to conclusions I prefer they not reach. I am telling you this now, because I believe you have earned the unabridged version. Harry said nothing for a moment. He thought about his hands on Quirrell's face, and about the burning that had come from inside him, and about the 10 years he had spent in the cupboard for a protection that was nothing like the one that had just saved his life. So even after the adoption, he said, Voldemort can't just touch me the way Quirrell tried to. Not with ease. Your mother's love remains present in your blood and still acts as it did tonight. The bond of blood was a separate protection, the specific guard against Voldemort, locating and reaching you during the periods you are away from Hogwarts. Without it, I will make other arrangements. I have already begun. They will not be as strong, but they will exist, and you will not be unguarded. Harry turned his head. Are you angry with me? Dumbledore's expression did something careful. I am many things, he said. I am not angry with you. I am reconsidering what the word safe has meant in my planning for the past decade. I believe it is well past time I did so. He looked at Harry with the expression Harry had come to understand was his honest face, the one that lived beneath the deliberate one. I am also relieved that you are awake and intact. I'm intact, Harry said. Good, said Dumbledore. That is a good place to begin. The visiting hour was 4 o'clock. Hermione arrived at the stroke of it, carrying her bag, and sat at the foot of Harry's bed without saying anything dramatic. She opened her book, Hogwarts: A History, which she had apparently been reading cover to cover and was apparently still not finished, and settled in with the quality of someone who has planned to stay. Ron arrived 8 minutes later with a bag of chocolate frogs and 3 exploding snap cards, which was a slightly inadequate number for the game, but Ron had apparently decided this was not a reason to wait. Dumbledore rose from his chair, gathered his upside-down book, and excused himself quietly. They played Exploding Snap in Harry's hospital bed, which was not strictly permitted, and which all 3 of them silently agreed not to draw attention to. The cards exploded twice. Ron lost both rounds in ways that Harry was reasonably sure Hermione had engineered without being obvious about it. At 9 o'clock, the Hogwarts matron came through the ward and found 2 non-patients in Harry Potter's bed, spoke to them briefly and with great clarity, and watched them leave. Harry lay back against the pillows and found, somewhat to his surprise, that he was smiling. Later, when the ward was dark and the other beds were quiet, Harry held his hands up. He could not see them in the dark, but they were there. The same hands he had always had, that had done his aunt's dishes and caught a snitch on a broom and pressed themselves against a dying man's face and burned something that had been trying to end him. He lay with his hands up and thought about his mother. She had stood between him and something unsurvivable and said no. The no had not ended when she did. It had gone into him and stayed there, every year of the cupboard and the hand-me-down clothes, and the birthday where no one came. She had been there in his blood the whole time, saying no, saying I choose him, saying this is what I leave him. He had been carrying her everywhere he went, and he had not known it. He thought, I carry something that belongs to her. I'll carry it everywhere I go. He could call it her love if he wanted. He thought he did want. He put his hands down and went to sleep. The note arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a school owl that landed on the end of Harry's bed. He recognized the handwriting. He unfolded it. The court has made its decision in your favor. You are now, in the eyes of Muggle law, the Grangers' son. I offer you my congratulations and my commitment to provide what alternative protections I can arrange before term resumes in September. That was all. No signature. Dumbledore signed everything. His letters, his notes, his announcements, his remarks in the margins of submitted essays. The omission sat at the bottom of the parchment, like something that had been decided against, which Harry thought was, in its way, the most honest part. He sat with it for a moment. Then he went downstairs. Hermione was in the common room, sitting with a book open on her lap, not reading it, a condition Harry had learned to recognize as Hermione experiencing something she was not yet ready to process sequentially. Ron was playing chess against himself, which was a thing he did when he was bored, and which he also won decisively. "It's official," Harry said. "June 24th. Hermione said, "I know. My parents wrote an hour ago." Ron looked between them. "So is it properly done? The Muggle legal part?" "Muggle court," Harry said. "Yes." Ron absorbed this with the expression of someone for whom the details of Muggle legal process were interesting in the way that maps of places you'd never been were interesting. "So you're Hermione's brother now?" he said. Harry said, "I suppose I am." Hermione went very pink. "We are definitively not siblings in any conventional or meaningful sense," she said, at a level of precision that suggested she had been thinking about this possibility since October. A pause. Then, in the other voice, the one without the precision, "But you're coming to live with us." "Yeah," Harry said. "I am." The Hogwarts Express arrived at King's Cross in the early evening of the last day of term, and the students poured through the barrier into the Muggle world with the particular energy of people who had been studying and were now, emphatically, not. Harry came through almost last because he had needed a moment on the other side of the barrier before the crowd came through. He stepped out, and the noise of the station pressed in on all sides, and he saw them immediately. They were standing together with Hermione between them, a woman with bushy dark hair and an expression of careful attentiveness that was entirely Hermione's, and a man with a frank and steady face and the bearing of someone who does not spend energy on unnecessary things. They were looking at Harry, not at the scar, at him. The man stepped forward and extended his hand. His handshake was firm without being a demonstration. "We have been looking forward to meeting you properly, Harry." Harry looked at his hand and then at his face and said, "Thank you for all of it." The man said, "That's what people do." It was the simplest possible response. Harry thought about it for the rest of the evening. He was heading toward the exit when a hand touched his shoulder, light and brief. He turned. Dumbledore, not dramatically, not with silver robes and significance, just a tall man with silver hair and a long beard in a crowd of Muggle parents, somehow managing to be exactly what he was, and somehow not attracting the notice he should have attracted. He looked at Harry with the honest face. "It has broken," he said, quietly. "Just now, I could feel it go. I wanted you to know that I know." Harry waited. "Your mother loved you very much," Dumbledore said. "What you carry of hers is not diminished by any of this." He looked at Harry for a count of 3, and then he turned and walked into the crowd, and by the time Harry looked back for him, he was gone. Harry stood still. He thought, "I know." He thought, she didn't have to live anywhere specific for that to be true. He turned and went toward the family waiting at the exit. The car smelled of dental mints and an air freshener shaped like a small green tree on the mirror. Hermione produced a book approximately 30 seconds after the car started, which Harry noted with the ease of someone who had been sitting next to her in class for 9 months and knew this was simply how she travelled. He looked out the window. England in late June was green and long lit, the kind of evening that stretched past what felt like its natural end. He had been in cars before, Muggle cars going places he had no say about, but this was different. This car was going somewhere that was going to be his. He didn't know what the house looked like. He turned that thought over and found that he wanted to find out, which was a different relationship to not knowing than the one he was used to. The house was on a quiet road with a front garden and a knocker and an entryway that smelled of something clean and something cooking. Hermione's mother said, "Come on then, we'll show you your room." The room was on the first floor, window over the back garden, the light still coming in at a long angle. A bed with a proper mattress. A desk. Her father explained they had assumed he would want to study, that Hermione had mentioned he had some work to catch up on, which was not strictly true, but Harry let it go, because the intention was clear. A window that opened. A door with a lock that was for privacy. Harry stood in the doorway for a moment. "It's good," he said. Her father said, "It's yours." Supper was at the kitchen table, and there was enough food, which Harry registered before he registered anything else. His plate was filled before he had the chance to wonder whether he should ask. Hermione talked about the year-end exams with the particular enthusiasm she had for things that had gone well. Her parents asked Harry questions, what subjects he had liked most, whether he played any sports, what kind of music he listened to, whether he had seen any decent films. Not about Voldemort, not about the scar, not about anything Harry had been in the papers for, which he suspected they had quietly agreed on in advance. "What kind of biscuits do you like?" her mother asked. Harry thought. No one had asked him this before. "Chocolate digestive," he said. She got up from the table, came back with the packet, and set it in front of him. He ate 4. Nobody counted. Nobody looked at the packet, and then back at him in the way that meant it wasn't really for him. That night he lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling. His wand was on the desk. The invisibility cloak was folded over the back of the chair. He had put it there in the open because he could. He could hide it if he chose. He did not have to. The difference between choosing to and having to was something he was still learning to locate in himself, and every time he found it, it felt like a door opening somewhere. The bond of blood was gone. He had known it since the platform, felt its absence as a confirmation rather than a loss. The charm had tethered him to an address, and the tether had snapped, and he was still himself on the other side of it. Lily's love was still in his blood. Voldemort would return, eventually. Dumbledore had been honest enough to tell him that much. Things were not resolved. They were in a particular state, better than before, and temporary, and his to navigate. But tonight there was a window he could open, a door he could close, a house that would know him in the morning. He was 11 years old, nearly 12. He had a year of school behind him, and another ahead of him, and a summer that had a shape, and a life that was, for the first time, partially